The sun had barely risen when Claire packed the last of her things into the worn-out suitcase that once belonged to her mother. The light from the window fell across the faded floral wallpaper, the same walls that had watched her grow from a curious child into a restless young woman. Now they would watch her leave. Her father, Daniel, stood in the doorway, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his face lined with quiet exhaustion. The years had carved deep creases around his eyes, not from laughter, but from worry, from the kind of silence that builds between people who love each other but have forgotten how to speak. "Do you really have to go?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. Claire didn't look up. "I can't stay here forever, Dad." He nodded, but the movement seemed heavy, as if agreeing with her cost him something. "It's just, this house feels too big without you." She zipped the suitcase shut. "It's already felt that way for years." The words hung between them like smoke. Impossible to swallow, impossible to clear. When she walked out the front door, Daniel didn't try to stop her. He simply watched as she carried her life down the porch steps, past the rosebush her mother had planted before she died, past the wooden fence Daniel still hadn't fixed. The old truck waiting by the curb belonged to her friend, Mason, who gave Daniel a small, awkward nod before helping Claire load her bag. "Goodbye, Dad," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. He tried to smile. "Goodbye, sweetheart." But she didn't look back. The truck rolled down the long dirt road, and Daniel stood there until the dust settled and the world went still again. Inside the house, her absence was immediate. The echo of her laughter, the one that had once filled every room, was replaced by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the old floorboards. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from him. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to cry. Claire's first days in the city were dizzying. The noise, the movement, the sheer scale of everything. It was overwhelming but intoxicating. She found a small apartment near her new job, an entry-level position at a marketing firm that promised opportunity and independence. The two things she had been chasing since her teenage years. A night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling both free and unbearably alone. Her coworkers were kind but distant. They talked about weekend trips and rooftop bars, about promotions and new restaurants. All the things that made the city sparkle for people who weren't trying to escape something. Claire smiled and nodded, pretending she belonged. But there was a heaviness inside her she couldn't shake. Every now and then, she would reach for her phone, scroll through the contacts, and hover over her father's name. But she never pressed call. She didn't know what to say. Daniel, meanwhile, fell into a rhythm of quiet routine. He fixed things around the house that didn't need fixing, mowed the lawn twice a week, and started leaving the porch light on at night, though he never admitted why. The house, once filled with Claire's energy and her mother's warmth, now felt like a museum of ghosts. One evening, while cleaning the attic, he found an old box of Claire's childhood drawings. One picture caught his eye, a messy crayon sketch of their family. Claire, her mother, and him, holding hands in front of the same house they still lived in. Over their heads, she had written, "Home is where love lives." Daniel sat there for a long time, the paper trembling in his hands. He remembered the day Claire had drawn it. She was 6, and her mother had just come home from the hospital after another round of treatment. She had been so full of hope, so certain that love could fix anything. When his wife passed 2 years later, that hope vanished. Daniel buried himself in work, in silence, in everything except the one thing that mattered, being there for his daughter. Now, sitting alone in the dim attic, he realized how much of her childhood he had missed, how much of their bond had faded under the weight of his grief. He picked up his phone and dialed her number. It rang 3 times, then went to voicemail. "Hey, it's me," he said awkwardly. "Just wanted to hear your voice. Hope you're doing okay." He paused, searching for the right words. "Call me sometime, all right?" He hung up and stared at the phone for a long time, but it never rang back. Months passed. Claire settled into her job, got promoted, and began to make a name for herself. From the outside, her life looked perfect, but the more she achieved, the more hollow it all felt. One evening, while leaving work, she noticed an old man sitting on the curb outside the office. He was thin, his clothes torn, his eyes distant. People passed him without a glance, but something about him made Claire stop. She approached slowly. "Sir, are you all right?" The man looked up, blinking in confusion. I'm fine, he murmured. Just resting. She hesitated. Do you have somewhere to go? He smiled faintly. Used to. Not anymore. For reasons she couldn't explain, Claire handed him the coffee she was holding. Here. It's still warm. The man accepted it with trembling hands. You're kind, he said softly. You remind me of someone. Claire smiled, though her throat tightened. Maybe your daughter? He nodded slowly. Maybe. I haven't seen her in years. They talked for a few minutes before Claire had to leave, but as she walked away, his words echoed in her mind. I haven't seen her in years. That night, she dreamed of her father, standing at the gate, watching her leave. In the dream, he didn't say anything. He just looked tired, the way he did that morning. When she woke, her pillow was wet with tears. The next weekend, she called him for the first time in months. He answered after 2 rings, his voice cautious but hopeful. Claire? Hey, Dad. There was a pause, then a shaky laugh. It's good to hear your voice. Yeah, she said softly. You too. They talked for a while, about work, the weather, the new neighbor's dog, small things, but they felt like steps toward something bigger. Before hanging up, Daniel said, I'm proud of you, you know. She didn't know what to say. For so long, she had been chasing approval from people who barely knew her, and now, the words she'd always wanted came from the one person she had been avoiding. Thanks, Dad, she whispered. That means a lot. After the call ended, Daniel sat on the porch, looking at the stars. The porch light flickered softly beside him. For the first time in years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. And far away in her small apartment, Claire stared at her phone, replaying his words over and over. She didn't know it yet, but the conversation had already planted a seed, one that would grow into the hardest, most beautiful lesson of her life, because sometimes, the love we spend years running from is the only love that was ever truly ours. Autumn came early that year. The trees outside Daniel's house turned to fire, gold, amber, crimson, painting the quiet streets in a beauty that only deepened his loneliness. He tried calling Claire a few more times, sometimes just to hear her voice, sometimes to leave a short message. She answered occasionally, but her life was busy. Meetings, clients, deadlines. Always something that kept her from staying on the line for too long. Still, he was grateful for every word. He began to write her small letters, not to send, but to save. Notes about the garden, about the books he was reading, about memories he didn't want to lose. He stored them in a shoebox under his bed. Maybe one day, he thought, she'd find them. Meanwhile, in the city, Claire's life was moving faster than ever. She had earned another promotion, this time to senior strategist, a position she'd dreamed of since she started. Her face appeared in company newsletters. Her boss praised her at every meeting, but success had its price. The late nights at the office grew longer. Weekends disappeared into exhaustion. The friends she'd once gone out with drifted away, replaced by colleagues who smiled too much and meant too little. And then there was Mason, her old friend from home, the one who had driven her away that morning. They kept in touch for a while, but even that connection had faded. Sometimes she'd see his name flash across her phone, but she rarely answered. One night, after another 14-hour day, she sat in her apartment staring at her reflection in the darkened window. The city glowed below her, vibrant, alive, but inside, she felt nothing. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the messages from her dad. The last one read, "Made your favorite apple pie today. Didn't turn out the same without you here. I miss our Sunday dinners." She had never replied. Claire locked the screen and pressed her forehead against the glass, her breath fogging the window. For a moment, she imagined the sound of his voice, the smell of the house, the way the light used to pour through the kitchen in the mornings. Then she pushed it all away. I'll visit soon, she promised herself. Just not yet. Daniel's health had been slipping, though he didn't tell her. The back pain that had once been a dull ache became sharper, constant. He ignored the doctor's advice. Too stubborn to slow down, he filled his days with small tasks, repainting the porch, tending the garden, fixing the squeaky gate. He liked to keep busy. Motion made silence bearable. But in the evenings, when the pain set in and the house grew quiet, he'd sit on the couch with a cup of tea and whisper to the walls. Maybe next Sunday, he'd say. She said she might visit next Sunday. One rainy afternoon, Claire's phone rang in the middle of a meeting. She glanced at the screen. Dr. Ellis. Her father's doctor. She frowned, confused. "Excuse me," She muttered to her colleagues and stepped out into the hallway. Hello? Miss Harper. The voice on the other end was gentle, cautious. I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your father. The world tilted. The hallway, the noise of office chatter, even her heartbeat seemed to vanish. What? What happened? He had a stroke this morning, the doctor said softly. He's stable, but it was severe. You should come as soon as possible. Claire didn't remember how she got to the hospital, only that she was suddenly there, standing in a white hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fear when she saw him, lying still under the harsh hospital lights, her breath caught in her throat. He looked smaller somehow, fragile. His eyes were closed, a tangle of tubes and wires running from his body. Dad, she whispered, taking his hand. It was cold. It's me, Claire. No response. The doctor explained that he might not wake up for a while, that recovery was uncertain. But Claire barely heard. She sat there for hours, holding his hand, whispering apologies she should have said years ago. I'm sorry, she said, again and again. I should have called more. I should have come home. I thought there would be time. The words dissolved into tears. Days passed. She barely left the hospital room. She worked remotely from her laptop by his bedside, eating from vending machines and sleeping in the chair. Nurses came and went, faces blurring into one another. Then, one morning, she woke to the sound of movement. Daniel's fingers twitched. Dad, she said, sitting up, his eyelids fluttered open. He looked at her, dazed, his voice rough and weak. Claire. She grabbed his hand, smiling through tears. Yeah, it's me. He blinked slowly, confusion clouding his expression. You came. Of course I came. He tried to smile. You always were stubborn. She laughed, the sound breaking into a sob. Guess I got that from you. He reached for her face, his hand trembling. Don't cry, sweetheart. I'm still here. I thought I lost you. Daniel shook his head. No, not yet. His voice grew quieter. You have your whole life ahead. Don't waste it on regrets like I did. She leaned closer. What do you mean? He looked at her with eyes full of love and sorrow. I wasted years being angry after your mother died. I let grief turn me into a stranger. Don't make the same mistake. Don't run from people who love you. Tears blurred her vision. I won't, Dad. I promise. He smiled faintly. Good girl. Then his eyes drifted shut again, the machines beeping steadily. Daniel was released 2 weeks later, weaker but alive. Claire took unpaid leave and moved back home temporarily to care for him. The house felt different now, smaller, quieter, but warmer somehow. She cooked him meals, helped him walk, and filled the silence with stories of her city life. They began to rebuild the bond they had lost. Each conversation was a thread, weaving them back together. Sometimes, when he napped in the armchair, she'd go through the old boxes in the attic. One day, she found the shoebox full of letters, all written to her. Her heart ached as she read them. You'd be proud of the tomatoes this year. The porch light's still on, just in case you ever come home late. I hope you're eating well. Sweetheart. She pressed the papers to her chest and cried. Not the sharp, angry tears of regret, but the slow, aching kind that come from realizing how much love you've taken for granted. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the porch, Daniel said quietly, You know, your mother used to say sunsets are proof that endings can be beautiful too. Claire smiled faintly. I think she was right. He turned to her. Promise me something. Anything. When I'm gone, don't let this house die. Keep the light on. Let it be a place where love lives. Her throat tightened. Dad, don't talk like that. He smiled. It's just a promise, sweetheart. For someday. She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. Okay, I promise. Winter came, blanketing the small town in quiet white. Daniel's health continued to waver. There were good days filled with laughter and bad ones filled with silence. Then, one night in late December, Claire woke to the sound of the wind howling outside. Something felt wrong. The house was too still. She rushed to her father's room. He was lying peacefully, a faint smile on his face, his hand resting on the same old photograph of their family. The world seemed to collapse in that single moment. She fell to her knees beside the bed, her voice breaking. No, please. But he was already gone. The funeral was small. The church pews filled with neighbors, old friends, and people Claire barely recognized. Masan Camito, standing quietly at the back, his eyes red. When it was over, Claire stayed long after everyone had left. She sat beside the fresh mound of earth, fingers tracing the name on the stone. Daniel Harper, loving father and husband. Home is where love lives. The same words from her childhood drawing. She didn't know who had chosen them, but somehow it felt right. That night, back at the house, she turned on the porch light. The glow spilled out across the snow, soft and steady. She stood there for a long time, whispering into the cold air, "I kept my promise, Dad." And though the wind answered with silence, she felt something warm brush against her heart, as if love itself had come home. The years slipped quietly past, like pages turning in a book she had once feared to finish. Claire still lived in the little house on the hill, the one her father built long before she was born. The walls were filled with echoes, laughter, memories, and the ghost of her father's voice, still whispering to her when the nights grew too long. She had turned one of the spare rooms into a studio, her sanctuary. Canvases leaned against every wall, each one an explosion of color and emotion. Painting had become her way of breathing, of remembering, of healing. Every stroke of the brush carried something of him. The warmth of his smile, the rhythm of his patience, the strength he'd given her even when his own was fading. People from town began to notice her art. It started with small exhibitions, local galleries, charity events. Then, slowly, the invitations grew. Within a few years, she had become known not for her old career in advertising, but as the woman who painted grief into light. And every piece she sold bore her signature in the bottom corner, a tiny golden porch light. Her father's light. Despite the growing recognition, Claire never left the town again. She'd had enough of skyscrapers and hollow conversations. The city, with all its noise and ambition, now seemed like a faded dream. Here, she had something real. She spent her mornings walking through the garden, the same one her father used to tend. The soil still carried traces of him, in the roses he'd planted for her mother, in the apple tree that leaned slightly toward the house as if listening. She talked to him sometimes, not out of madness, but out of love. "Dad, you wouldn't believe it," she'd say, watering the plants. "They want to feature my work in a national gallery next spring." The breeze would stir the leaves, and she'd smile softly. "I know. I'll take the old porch light with me. I promise." One evening, she received a letter. Not an email, an actual letter, written in neat handwriting she didn't recognize. It was from Mason. He had moved away years ago, but the letter carried the same warmth she remembered. "I heard about your art," he wrote. "Your father would have been proud. I visit his grave sometimes. He always talked about how you'd find your way back. Guess he was right." Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter. Memories of their last argument flashed through her mind. The shouting, the slammed door, the years lost between them. She sat for a long time, staring at the porch light glowing through the window. Then she picked up her phone and dialed his number. When he answered, his voice was quiet, uncertain. "Claire, it's me," she said. "It's been a long time." A pause. "Yeah, it has. I got your letter. Thank you. I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me." She took a breath. "I didn't either. But I'm glad you wrote." There was a silence, not the heavy kind that carried resentment, but the gentle one that comes when wounds begin to close. "Would you want to meet sometime?" Mason asked. Claire smiled faintly. "I'd like that." When they met a few days later, it was at the old cafe near the edge of town, the same place they'd gone as teenagers. Time had softened them both. His hair was flecked with gray, and her eyes carried a quiet wisdom that hadn't been there before. For a while, they just talked. About work, about their parents, about the little things life had stolen and returned in strange ways. And when Mason mentioned Daniel, there was no more bitterness, only gratitude. "He always believed in you," Mason said, "even when you didn't believe in yourself." Claire nodded. "Yeah, I think I finally understand what he meant." In the months that followed, Mason became part of her life again, not as a replacement for what was lost, but as a reminder that some connections, no matter how broken, can find their way back. They spent weekends fixing up the old barn behind the house. He helped her build shelves for her art supplies. She taught him how to cook her father's apple pie recipe, the one he never quite perfected. Sometimes, they'd sit on the porch together after sunset, sipping tea, watching the light glow softly against the dark. "Do you ever think he can see us?" Mason asked once. Claire looked up at the sky, where the stars shimmered like distant memories. I think he's here, she said. Every time that light's on, I feel him. Then came the day of her gallery debut, the biggest moment of her career. That it wasn't in the city she once called home, but in a nearby coastal town, a place full of light and open air. The exhibit was called Where the Light Stays. She brought the porch light with her and placed it near the entrance, glowing softly beside the first painting, a portrait of her father, not in perfect detail, but in color, emotion, and warmth. People came from far and wide. They stood in silence before her work, many of them moved to tears. Every painting told a story of love, loss, and the strength it takes to forgive yourself. After the event, an older woman approached her. "Your art," she said, her voice trembling. "It feels like home." Claire smiled gently. "That's exactly what it's meant to be." That night, after the gallery closed, Claire walked down to the pier alone. The sea stretched endlessly before her, waves whispering against the wooden planks. She held her father's old lighter, the one he used to light the porch lamp, and flicked it open. The flame danced for a moment before the wind took it. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, "for teaching me that love doesn't end. It just changes form." For a long moment, she stood there, breathing in the salt air, her heart steady, her soul quiet. And when she turned back toward the gallery, the reflection of the porch light shimmered in the water, glowing like a promise kept. Years passed again. The house remained full of life, laughter, music, and the scent of paint and fresh apples. Claire began hosting workshops for children from the town, teaching them how to paint, how to turn pain into beauty. She told them stories about her father, not the sad parts, but the ones filled with warmth. She always ended with the same words: "Keep your light on. Someone, somewhere, needs to see it." One evening, after the last student had gone home, Claire walked out to the porch. The air was cool, filled with the hum of crickets. She leaned on the railing, watching the light flicker softly beside her. Mason came up behind her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You okay?" She smiled. "Yeah, just thinking about him. Always." She looked out toward the horizon. "But it doesn't hurt anymore. It feels peaceful." He nodded. "He'd be proud." She turned to him, eyes glistening. "Maybe, but I think he'd just be happy that the light's still on." That night, as she closed the door and turned off the lights inside, the porch lamp remained glowing outside, steady, golden, eternal, and somewhere in the quiet dark, she thought she heard his voice again, soft, distant, carried by the wind. "You kept your promise, sweetheart." She smiled through her tears. "I did, Dad. I did." The stars above shimmered brighter, the air calm, the world at peace, because even after everything, the loss, the distance, the years, she had learned the simplest, hardest truth of all: love never really leaves. It just learns to stay in the light.